The dream of flying to the moon is almost 2,000 years old. It first appeared in the writings of Luciano de Samosata in the 2nd century AD. Accounts of trips to the moon became a lot more frequent in the 16th and 17th centuries, along with a growing interest in astronomy. But the main interest of the writers in those days was not scientific so much as satirical. They described societies on the moon as satirical counterparts to societies on Earth. So military conflicts on the moon became mirror images of conflicts between different monarchs on the Earth. And in some accounts, utopian societies on the moon were understood as a critique of the less than utopian ones that the authors themselves inhabited. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, the accounts became more influenced by science and technology, and in that context, flying to the moon really became imagined as the pinnacle of techno-scientific achievement. So many of the authors in the 19th century, such as Edgar Allan Poe or Jules Verne, were more interested in the technological means of getting to the moon than in what the travelers would find once they were on the moon. Jules Verne, in his famous novels From the Earth to the Moon and Around the Moon, imagined that spaceflight would be invented by frustrated military men. So in his vision, it's the members of an American gun club who find a world that becomes increasingly peaceful, frustrating, and so they transfer their interest in weapons technology and ballistics from guns and cannons to spaceships. And the spaceship that they construct is a sort of space cannon. This is ironic when you look back at it with more than 100 years of hindsight, and you realize that the actual lunar landing took place in the context of the Cold War competition between the USSR and the USA. So whereas in real life, the spaceflight technology was developed as part and parcel of the development of the Cold War arms race, Jules Verne saw it connected with military technology, but imagined that it was increasing peace and the inability to use military technology that would drive spaceflight. George Méliès was the first cinematographer to present a science fiction film in Voyage dans la Lune, Trip to the Moon in 1902. And what is striking about his film is that for the first time he presented moving images of a trip to the moon, and also presented very foresighfully images of an Earthrise that only became reality with the Apollo 8 mission in 1968. So he already shows Earth rising above the surface of the moon and being looked at by humans. But the more important film in the early 20th century that really anticipated real spaceflight technology was Fritz Lang's A Woman in the Moon from 1929, which had a very realistic portrayal of how the rocket would be built, how it would be launched from a water pool, how different segments would detach in different phases of the flight, and how the interior of the spaceship would feature cots that the travelers could lie on, attached with belts to withstand the gravity pressure during the ascent, and how they would be held in place by grips for their hands and feet when the rocket ship entered zero gravity. Die Frau im Mond, The Woman in the Moon, this film by Fritz Lang, also introduced the device of the countdown, which was later used in real space technology. Neil Armstrong, the astronaut who first set foot on the moon, famously marked his first walk on the lunar surface with the words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for humankind." So that expresses a cosmopolitan vision of humankind moving into a new phase of development. But just a few moments later, he planted the American flag on the lunar surface. So that was obviously a gesture of nationalism and nationalist ownership, as well as a sign of victory over the USSR, whom the USA had beaten in the race to space. Now, this duality of cosmopolitanism and assertion of particularity, of aggression and warfare, is present from the earliest examples of accounts of trips to the moon. In Luciano of Samosata's book, the travelers land on the moon only to find themselves embroiled immediately in a fight between the king of the moon and the king of the sun over possession of the morning star, which Lucian meant as a satirical comment on monarchical struggles over territorial possessions on Earth. Or take one of the latest examples, Kim Stanley Robinson's novel Red Moon, which appeared in 2018, where you have Chinese and Americans struggling for domination over colonies on the moon. So from the beginning to the end of this tradition, its latest manifestations, we find this tension between, on one hand, the step onto the moon being the next step in the evolution of humankind, and on the other hand, it being a victory for one particular group of humans over the other. In the 19th and 20th centuries, travel to the moon has mostly been presented as the pinnacle of techno-scientific achievement and, in some ways, the summit of modernity. In that respect, it then becomes associated both with utopian hopes and with dystopian forms of critique or recognition of limits. So take Jules Verne's famous novels about traveling to the moon. On one hand, the technology of traveling into outer space is described in loving detail and clearly is celebrated as a technological achievement by Verne. On the other hand, his spaceship never reaches the moon. The travelers just go around the moon and then return to the Earth in order to plan further extraterrestrial adventures. Or take a novel that was published 40 years later in 1901, the novel The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Well, here, two British men travel to the moon and they find an alien society there, but the Selenites, the inhabitants of the moon, ultimately cut off communication with humans because they're so taken aback at the accounts of human aggression, warfare, and violence that they hear about from these two travelers. So in some sense, even though the Selenites look scary, they're these insectoid aliens, they're actually, in the end, less frightening than humans with their modern technology. So these are two examples of where famous authors, the fathers of science fiction, celebrate the technology that takes humans into space, but also express criticism and skepticism toward it. Between the development of V-2 rockets during World War II and the first lunar landing in 1969, the representation of colonies on the moon and trips to the moon was fairly standard, especially in American science fiction. This was because the V-2 rockets had made it clear that spaceship was a technological possibility. Once it had been achieved, trips to the moon in science fiction and science fiction film did not go away, but they had less importance. So the imagination shifted instead to the imagination of new digital technologies. That was the big contribution of cyberpunk science fiction in the 1980s, where travel into outer space is really replaced with travel into digital space. And along with that, there's also a shift to the imagination of trips to Mars. A lot of the NASA scientists and engineers who had actually developed the means of traveling to the moon were very disappointed when the Apollo mission stopped in the 1970s. And that was so because they had actually looked at the moon travel as just the first step on the way toward travel to other planets, especially Mars. And so they saw that curtailed once the lunar mission stopped. So the imagination there definitely shifted to Mars as another destination. For many centuries, trips to the moon were indeed associated with white men, mostly. And women only come into focus really with Fritz Lang's 1929 film, The Woman in the Moon, where you have a woman astronomer who's superbly trained scientifically and also has exactly the same spirit of adventure and the same courage that the male travelers have. But the imagination of trips to the moon only changed more decisively after the 1960s, when science fiction at large was really transformed by the influx of feminist science fiction writers, so women writers who wanted to think about social realities and about gender, and also by writers from a lot of different national traditions as well as from minority cultures in the US. If you look at a recent novel such as Red Moon by Kim Stanley Robinson, you find that Chinese characters are just as important as American characters. So yes, the imagination has finally changed, and it's not only white men traveling to the moon, but it has taken us centuries to get there. There's both an indirect and a direct relationship between the imagination of space travel and the way in which our own futures on planet Earth are imagined. The indirect relationship is that when authors such as Ursula K. Le Guin or Orson Scott Card picture alien ecologies on other planets, they really use that as a means for making us reflect on our own natural systems on planet Earth and how human interventions change it. So in that way, indirectly, the imagination of space flight is a way of making us think about the way we inhabit natural environments here on Earth. The direct connection is that there are visionaries and entrepreneurs who think that the current environmental crises might make Earth uninhabitable over the long run, and that humanity really needs a second habitat, a planet B as it's sometimes called. So an entrepreneur such as Elon Musk is very overtly talking about and planning on travel to Mars and settlements on Mars as an alternative to humanity inhabiting Earth. Now, this is very controversial, obviously, since a lot of environmentalists argue that, A, this is very expensive and won't be possible on a large scale for quite possibly thousands of years, and on the other hand, that it might make us neglect good stewardship of our natural ecologies here on Earth, and they, of course, resist that. Mars has, to some extent, become the new destination around which narratives of spaceflight revolve. And trips to Mars also have a long history in science fiction, not quite as long as those as stories about trips to the moon, but they do go back to the 19th century. And often these narratives parallel those that revolved around the moon, in the sense that Mars is often depicted as the site of an alternative utopian society from which the shortfalls of societies on Earth can be criticized. And on the other hand, sometimes Mars is just an expanded arena of conflict for earthly powers. You see that beautifully illustrated in Kim Stanley Robinson's trilogy Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, that was written in the 1990s, where Crisis on Earth continues even as a settlement on Mars gradually develops to include millions of people that are still being fought over by some of the same governments and corporations as on Earth, but where people do in the end manage to establish an at least ambiguously utopian society. There's no question that science fiction has inspired careers in technology and certain kinds of technological innovation. So the two prominent examples would be spaceflight and cloning, which were both anticipated in science fiction long before they became technological realities. But the reverse is also true. Science fiction did not foresee some technological developments accurately. So for a long time in science fiction, as computers were described as acquiring more power, they were also described as becoming larger, whereas there are almost no science fiction texts or films that anticipate all of us carrying around computers more powerful than those that were about the Apollo space missions in our backpacks and pockets. That was a development that was quite unanticipated by science fiction. We should also add that science fiction was not completely focused on science and technology alone, and especially from the 1960s onward, many science fiction writers became more interested in the interrelation between technological innovation and social change, or just in social change and social futures, period. So the relationship between science, scientific innovation, and social innovation is complex, and there are a lot of feedback loops between them.